and welcome to #Africa. I'm Michelle Craig. Let's take a look at stories making headlines on the continent. Kenya's Jomo Kenyatta International Airport was shut down earlier this week, leaving hundreds stranded. Kenya Airways staff protested over contracts and job security. Protesters were eventually dispersed by riot police. Travel schedules had to be revised and some flights cancelled, with the airline advising passengers not to come to the airport. United Nations Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet has urged politicians in Cameroon to stop hate speech and heavy-handed tactics by security forces. Bachelet says if not, the country will fall even further into violence. Tensions between separatists and Islamists have erupted into conflict, leaving 1.3 million people in need of aid. She says officials should protect civilians during counter-terrorism operations by working with the UN. Officials in Cameroon say accusations of violations by security personnel are being investigated. And on a happy note, a Somali refugee has found love and a new home in Rwanda. Ali Abdi had to flee his home due to conflict and ended up in Kigali. Rwanda has progressive policies towards refugees. It helped him start a small business running a convenience store in the city. That's where he met his wife, who is Rwandan. More than 150,000 refugees are currently living in Rwanda. Now, a statue of former Burkina Faso President Thomas Sankara has been unveiled in Ouagadougou, this more than 30 years after his assassination. Joining us now to discuss the significance of the statue is political analyst Tapiwa Chadia. Thanks very much for your time, Mr. Chadia. I mean, he's remembered by many as the father of the revolution, as an icon of Pan-Africanism. But in your view, tell us about Thomas Sankara, the man, and what he still represents.
Thank you very much for having me. Well, I believe Thomas Sankara was more than an African. The ideas and ideologies that he had towards the African Renaissance as the icon, as the champion of it, was very great and magnificent. Just a week before he was assassinated, he said, you could kill a person as an individual who is a champion of democracy and change, but ultimately you cannot kill the idea. The ideas that he instilled in Africa are very profound, and the things that he was doing in his country in a very short space of time that he was in power were magnificent, and he made so many changes in the country, and he was a darling within Burkina Faso.
I mean, he was in power, as you say, for such an incredibly short time, but just judging from what you're saying, his achievements still continue today. They still continue to echo on the continent.
Yes. So he was a legend. He was a stabilizer. What he did when he took power is that he instilled social, ecological, and economical changes within the country. And he also changed the name from being the country called the Upper Vault, and he changed it to Burkina Faso, which meant upright men. And when he did that, so some of the things that he did in the country was to change the foreign policy in the country, by having an anti-imperialism policy. He also had debt reduction, which also was not welcome from the IMF and the World Bank, because for them, remember, the IMF and the World Bank, because they still want Africa to be dependent, they then would come with economic structural adjustment programs for Africans. But then he was against that. He also then had to have a domestic policy, which helped in terms of the vaccination of about 1.5 million kids. He encouraged villages and communities to build for themselves, to build medical centers. There were about more than 350 medical centers, which were built by the communities, because he said we need to be self-sustaining. So he encouraged them to build something, a legacy for them as a community, which then would belong to the people. So, and he also changed the ownership of land from the imperialist landlords to the peasants, thereby giving people power and giving them the ability to have self-sustaining agrarian mechanisms in Burkina Faso. What he did was amazing, was splendid. And there's a direct contrast to what he did and what he stood for to what we currently see happening in Africa.
You know, I just wonder what his view would be on this statue being erected in his honor now. I mean, the country says it's a way of solidifying his place in history. But just given the scale of the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Burkina Faso, was this the right time?
Well, there is never a right time to do anything, but I believe this comes in as a good gesture. This comes in as a reminder of what Thomas Sankara stood for. He stood for democracy, governance, and human rights, and he was taken directly from Karl Marx and from Lenin. And the things that he did in Burkina Faso, I believe they deserve to be celebrated, but not just in Burkina Faso, but they also need to be celebrated, even in Africa and the broader world at large, because I believe very few political leaders have the capabilities of doing what Thomas Sankara did. Remember, he also came in and assisted the issues of the previously disadvantaged in the community, which are women, and is coming into an African country which has got the principle and policies of primogeniture, which only seeks to uplift men. But he came in and addressed all of that. He changed his stance and he said he's going to stop. There was a prohibition of female genital mutilation. There was also an issue of prohibition of the kings and the chieftainship, who were also exploiting cheap labor and abusing people. He came in and changed all of that, putting women first, putting them in high government positions, saying even if you are a woman and you are pregnant, you still have value in the country. So all the ideologies and whatever he stood for, it deserves to be respected and it deserves to be celebrated. So I believe the statue, even though it's coming after a very long time, but it is there to address and to celebrate the life and legacy of the one and only African Pan-Africanist, Thomas Sankara.
All right, well, thanks very much for your time. Political analyst Tapiwa Chadia joining us there as we commemorate the unveiling of the statue of the former Burkina Faso president. And when we return, the UN is calling for aid to be sent to Burkina Faso. We'll bring you more on that story in just a moment.